It began, as these things often do, with a place that was too quiet. East Sundell, Kentucky, sits like a paused breath in the Appalachian foothills, a patchwork of sloping farmland and dusty roads, where the church bells ring just before noon, and the old general store still sells licorice by the ounce. It's a town nearly forgotten by time. Even in 1891, its heart beats slow and steady, wrapped in the myth of its own peace. But peace is a costume, and this town was wearing it poorly. I arrived in East Sundell in the fall of 1913, 22 years after the fact. The air still carried the scent of rot in certain corners, soil that refused to grow, windows that never opened. People didn't speak much about the Frayne house anymore, though every child knew to avoid it. Most adults pretended it never existed at all. But I wasn't here to pretend. At the center of it all stood 14 Bramble Street, a salt box house that sagged with age even when it was new, the Frayne residence. To the casual passerby, it might have appeared like any other home, faded shutters, chimney slightly crooked, and a picket fence leaning at odd angles like drunken sentries. But for those who remembered, 14 Bramble was something else entirely. A place where infants cried through boarded windows, a place where the basement door was always bolted shut from the outside, and a place, it was whispered, where mirrors refused to show what was real. It was Sheriff Harlan Cole who finally opened that basement door on the morning of October 4th, 1891. He would never speak of what he saw beyond it. Retired just 3 days later, moved to Alabama, drank himself dead by spring. The only document I could find from that day was a sealed police log, most of it redacted, but one sentence survived. Every mirror faced a crib, and none reflected back. No one ever explained what that meant, but it was the phrase that started my descent, a line that wrapped itself around my mind like a noose. I've spent the last 3 years reconstructing the Frayne case, piecing together old town ledgers, interviewing descendants, and following a breadcrumb trail of buried testimonies, lost diaries, and long-ignored medical files. There was a system here beneath the decay, something deliberate. The tragedy that happened in East Sundell wasn't spontaneous. It was cultivated. In this season of the Macabre record, I'll take you back to a year that still stains this town's soil. I'll show you the family whose kindness masked something feral. I'll bring you into the rooms they never let guests see, the basement they never entered without a cross and a key. And when we reach the bottom of this story, you may find yourself doing what I did, placing a mirror in your child's nursery, watching closely, waiting to see if the reflection blinks first. Because this is the story of the macabre basement where every mirror faced a crib and none reflected back. To understand the horror of what happened in East Sundell, you first have to understand the Fraynes. Dr. Silas Frayne and his wife Eleanor were not just respected, they were revered. Arriving in East Sundell in the summer of 1879, they were seen as a blessing incarnate. The town's first formally trained physician and a woman of extraordinary grace and charity. They moved into 14 Bramble Street with an heirloom piano and 3 Persian cats. Within weeks, Eleanor had begun organizing charity circles for mothers of sickly children, while Dr. Frayne began treating the miners for coal dust and crushed fingers, often refusing payment. They were, as every surviving journal described them, too good to be true. Silas was a tall, dry-voiced man with narrow features and a high, uneven hairline that gave him a ghost-like silhouette. His patients called him the gentle leech. He never raised his voice, and he never turned anyone away. Eleanor was his mirror in poise, sun hats, embroidered gloves, and always the smell of violet water. She spoke with a northern lilt and often quoted scripture to justify her kindness. "Let the little children come to me," she once said, pressing a fresh blanket into a grieving mother's arms after a miscarriage. That mother was later found hanging in her barn. The blanket had vanished. There were no children of their own, which at the time only made them more angelic in the eyes of the town. They cared for everyone else's. The Fraynes took in orphans, not legally adopted, there's no record of that. But it wasn't unusual then for childless couples to foster informally. Over the course of a decade, they were said to have housed at least 10 children, infants mostly, all young, all quiet, none ever seen past the age of 5. Neighbors remembered glimpses, small faces in high windows, always pale, always watching, never playing outside. One child was spotted in the upstairs gable window every Sunday like clockwork, rocking slowly in a chair while the church bell tolled. The Frains were honored at church socials and even featured in the Lexington Herald under the headline, Saints of Sundell. But here's the strange part, and I didn't realize this until I started combing through census ledgers, cross-checking school enrollment and birth records. None of those children ever appeared on paper, not a single name. It's as if they never officially existed. Every person I spoke to who remembered the Frains spoke of them with a kind of nervous affection, as if recalling the MIT always begins with the smallest things. A dog that won't go near a certain fence, a child who comes home crying but can't say why, a sound in the night that no one dares confirm. In East Sundell, the first signs that something was wrong at the Frain house weren't screamed or scrawled. They were whispered, and then they were buried. The first was a boy named Enoch Purdy. He was 5 at the time, barely tall enough to see over a fence. He lived 2 doors down from the Frains. In 1884, Enoch told his mother he saw the blue baby in their basement window. She thought it was just a dream, but he kept describing it, a crib right against the window pane with a baby lying still, blue as a bruise, staring up. He didn't blink, Enoch said, and the mirror above him kept moving on its own. A week later, Enoch stopped talking altogether. His mother told me that night terrors followed. He wouldn't sleep unless every mirror in the house was covered with cloth. The Frains said it must be a fever. Dr. Frain offered laudanum to calm the child. The boy's mother never went near 14 Bramble again. Other incidents followed. Mrs. Carraway, the town laundress, recalled Eleanor bringing down sheets for washing every Friday, always white, always stiff. But in the spring of 1886, Eleanor began bringing a second bundle. Small gowns, yellowed bonnets, and what looked like swaddling cloths, but all of them dyed in a strange, splotched grey. Not blood, not dirt, something else. Like the water remembered something it couldn't clean, Mrs. Carraway said. When she mentioned it, Eleanor simply smiled and told her, infants purify differently. That same year, a reverend's wife, Mrs. Agnes Prater, tried to deliver a gift to the Frains for their children, a handmade quilt. She knocked, was let in, and immediately noticed the silence. No laughter, no toys, no children. Eleanor took the quilt, thanked her stiffly, and shut the door. Mrs. Prater later told her husband that the parlor smelled of copper and citrus, and something else, like wet wood and old milk. By 1887, the postmaster Arthur Dole began noticing irregular deliveries to 14 Bramble, crates labeled glass, fragile, always addressed from an unlisted apothecary in Ohio. One box arrived shattered, leaking what looked like silvering solution, the compound used to treat the backs of mirrors. Eleanor signed for it without question. And then there was the problem of the mirrors. Multiple neighbors noted that in every room visible from the street there was a mirror, not unusual on its own. But what made it strange was how each mirror was angled, downward, tilted to face the floor, or in some cases, a piece of furniture. One child, 16-year-old Etta Banning, claimed to have seen something even more disturbing. While walking past the Frain basement window, she swore she saw a series of mirrors, hung like paintings, each facing an empty crib. When she stopped to look again, Eleanor appeared behind the glass, smiling, unblinking. No one believed her. She was later sent to a sanatorium in Richmond after her behavior grew erratic. She wouldn't go near her own reflection. Over time, the whispers multiplied. Why did none of the Frain children ever attend church? Why were the curtains always drawn? Why did the midwife, Marlene Beek, vanish after visiting the Frains during a supposed home birth? Marlene's body was never found. A week later, Eleanor donated a new altar cloth to the chapel, deep crimson velvet embroidered with vines. The pastor accepted it gratefully. Still, no one spoke out. The town needed a doctor, and perhaps, more deeply, They needed to believe that something kind still existed in the dark valleys around them. I asked a local historian, one of the few who even acknowledged the case, why no one ever intervened. She paused, then said, "Because we were told they were angels. And angels don't harm children. But angels don't bolt their basements shut. They don't receive crates of mirrors every month. And they don't wrap silence around a house like a burial shroud." The truth was beginning to form even then. You could see it in the spaces between the curtains, in the soft scuffing under the floorboards, in the children who never grew up, and soon the Frains would start pulling away, cutting off what little light remained. When I pressed her, she trembled and muttered, "They said it was better before the soul remembers its sins." The Frains hosted lectures in their parlour on topics like moral hygiene and spiritual innocence. Eleanor, in particular, often spoke on the harmful impurities of the maternal bond. Her diary, which I eventually acquired in part from a great-nephew, included a disturbing passage. "The child is the vessel. The soul is unclean by nature. God allows the second birth when the first is flawed. The mirror shows what's been left behind." I didn't understand what she meant then. I do now. In photographs, the Frains look perfectly normal. Stiff postures, straight collars. Eleanor's eyes never quite focused on the camera. Silas, always a hand on her shoulder, like he was steadying her from something, or stopping her from moving. But no one suspected anything. Because who would question the people who were caring for the forgotten? Who would doubt the kindness of the only doctor within 40 miles? Who would look twice at a home where every window glowed with the soft flicker of oil lamps? You trust people like that. You let them take the babies no one else could raise. And in East Sundell, in 1891, trust was just another word for disappearance. It always begins with the smallest things: a dog that won't go near a certain fence, a child who comes home crying but can't say why, a sound in the night that no one dares confirm. In East Sundell, the first signs that something was wrong at the Frain house weren't screamed or scrawled. They were whispered, and then they were buried. The first was a boy named Enoch Purdy. He was 5 at the time, barely tall enough to see over a fence. He lived 2 doors down from the Frains. In 1884, Enoch told his mother he saw the blue baby in their basement window. She thought it was just a dream, but he kept describing it. A crib right against the window pane with a baby lying still, blue as a bruise, staring up. He didn't blink, Enoch said, and the mirror above him kept moving on its own. A week later, Enoch stopped talking altogether. His mother told me that night terrors followed. He wouldn't sleep unless every mirror in the house was covered with cloth. The Frains said it must be a fever. Dr. Frain offered laudanum to calm the child. The boy's mother never went near 14 Bramble again. Other incidents followed. Mrs. Carraway, the town laundress, recalled Eleanor bringing down sheets for washing every Friday, always white, always stiff. But in the spring of 1886, Eleanor began bringing a second bundle. Small gowns, yellowed bonnets, and what looked like swaddling cloths, but all of them dyed in a strange, splotched grey. Not blood, not dirt, something else. Like the water remembered something it couldn't clean, Mrs. Carraway said. When she mentioned it, Eleanor simply smiled and told her, infants purify differently. That same year, a reverend's wife, Mrs. Agnes Prater, tried to deliver a gift to the Frains for their children, a handmade quilt. She knocked, was let in, and immediately noticed the silence. No laughter, no toys, no children. Eleanor took the quilt, thanked her stiffly, and shut the door. Mrs. Prater later told her husband that the parlour smelled of copper and citrus, and something else, like wet wood and old milk. By 1887, the postmaster Arthur Dole began noticing irregular deliveries to 14 Bramble, crates labelled glass, fragile, always addressed from an unlisted apothecary in Ohio. One box arrived shattered, leaking what looked like silvering solution, the compound used to treat the backs of mirrors. Eleanor signed for it without question. And then there was the problem of the mirrors. Multiple neighbors noted that in every room visible from the street there was a mirror, not unusual on its own. But what made it strange was how each mirror was angled, downward, tilted to face the floor, or in some cases, a piece of furniture. One child, 16-year-old Etta Banning, claimed to have seen something even more disturbing. While walking past the Frayne basement window, she swore she saw a series of mirrors, hung like paintings, each facing an empty crib. When she stopped to look again, Eleanor appeared behind the glass, smiling, unblinking. No one believed her. She was later sent to a sanatorium in Richmond after her behavior grew erratic. She wouldn't go near her own reflection. Over time, the whispers multiplied. Why did none of the Frayne children ever attend church? Why were the curtains always drawn? Why did the midwife, Marlene Beek, vanish after visiting the Fraynes during a supposed home birth? Marlene's body was never found. A week later, Eleanor donated a new altar cloth to the chapel, deep crimson velvet embroidered with vines. The pastor accepted it gratefully. Still, no one spoke out. The town needed a doctor, and perhaps more deeply, they needed to believe that something kind still existed in the dark valleys around them. I asked a local historian, one of the few who even acknowledged the case, why no one ever intervened. She paused, then said, "Because we were told they were angels, and angels don't harm children. But angels don't bolt their basements shut, they don't receive crates of mirrors every month, and they don't wrap silence around a house like a burial shroud." The truth was beginning to form even then. You could see it in the spaces between the curtains, in the soft scuffing under the floorboards, in the children who never grew up, and soon the Fraynes would start pulling away, cutting off what little light remained. By the summer of 1888, 14 Bramble Street had become what locals called the Silent Hill House. It wasn't just metaphorical anymore. The Fraynes were actively cutting themselves off. A house that once hosted community teas and Sunday suppers began to shutter itself piece by piece, as if the family were sealing in something or someone. The first thing to disappear was the piano. It had been a centerpiece of Eleanor's gatherings. She played hymns with trembling elegance, Abide With Me, Rock of Ages, and her favorite, The Unclouded Day. Then, suddenly, it stopped, and no one was allowed inside the home again. Invitations dried up. Porch lights went unlit. Silas, once known to make house calls at all hours, began refusing patients after sundown. Children still whispered about the blue crib babies in the basement. Some swore they heard lullabies coming from the walls at night. Off-key, always the same melody. When a group of boys threw pebbles at the Fraynes' upstairs window one night, a curtain shifted, and a hand, small and greyish, slowly pulled it closed. Silas installed thick shutters the following day. The number of children reportedly staying at the house grew. One shopkeeper claimed Eleanor purchased 6 new cribs in the span of 3 months. All custom-built, all exactly the same size, not bassinets, cribs, as if for infants not meant to age. And yet, not one child was ever seen leaving. No local school had them enrolled. No doctor besides Silas ever examined them. Even the town's only priest, Father Antonin Rees, was denied entry when he offered a house blessing after hearing the rumors. He later confided in his diary, "She told me, 'This is already holy ground. The children are clean now. We have washed them free of their reflection.'" I asked what that meant. She just smiled and shut the door. By autumn, Eleanor had ceased attending church entirely. The women's charity group disbanded. Eleanor stopped sending letters. Silas began sourcing his medicines from out of state. Neighbors reported the odor of tinctures, sharp chemical, wafting from the chimney at strange hours. One man said it reminded him of burnt cloth and vinegar. In January 1889, the Fraynes erected a wooden fence, taller than any in East Sundell, sharp-spiked, painted tar black. The yard, once manicured, turned feral. Vines crawled unchecked, curling around the porch columns like strangling fingers. By now, even the most devoted townsfolk had begun keeping their distance. But one woman refused. Her name was Viola Finch, a former maid who worked for the Fraynes for nearly a decade before they dismissed her with no warning. She claimed she was let go after she asked too many questions about the babies that never stayed. I found Viola's personal letters buried in an old shoebox donated to the Kentucky Historical Society. Most were mundane, but one stood out, dated February 3rd, 1889, addressed to her cousin in Louisville. I know what I saw. The bassinets are full but not moving. There are mirrors above each one, and not a soul reflected, not even Eleanor's. She walks among them, whispering prayers in some language I can't place. Latin? Maybe older. The smell of milk curdles in the air, and always that song. Always. She ends the letter with a line that haunts me still. They aren't trying to raise children. They're trying to raise something clean, something that won't cast a shadow. Viola vanished 1 month later. Locals said she moved to Tennessee. No records exist, and through it all, no one from East Sundell intervened. There were murmurs, talk of going to the sheriff, of breaking in, of demanding to see the children. But fear is a paralyzing thing. And what the Frains had built was something deeper than dread. It was reverence. By 1890, the Frains had become untouchable ghosts, their windows dark, their garden dead, but smoke still curled from their chimney, deliveries continued, and the faint sounds of lullabies drifted on the wind at dusk, until one stormy night changed everything, and something made it out. It was a night the town still remembers, even if no one speaks of it. September 19th, 1890. Rain had been falling for 2 days. A bloated, relentless downpour that turned the sloped roads of East Sundell into rivers of clay and gravel. Thunder cracked like rifle fire above the hollows. Livestock broke their pens. Several homes flooded. But the worst of it, the most unforgettable part, came not from the storm, but from what was found just after it. At 4:17 a.m., a carriage barreled into the front yard of the Finch boarding house 2 miles from town. The horse collapsed from exhaustion. The driver was never identified, gone without a trace, but what they left behind was worse than anything East Sundell had ever seen. Inside the carriage, wrapped in a blood-soaked quilt, was a child, a girl, approximately 2 years old, emaciated. So pale she looked like wax. Her hair was damp and colorless. Her eyes were wide open but entirely white, pupils blown or perhaps missing. Her fingernails had been removed. She did not cry. She did not blink. Pinned to her nightdress was a scrap of stationery, torn cleanly along one side. In calligraphic ink, it read, "Return when ready." She still remembers. She was taken to the local infirmary. Dr. Myron Cutter, a visiting physician from Cincinnati, examined her. His official report, now buried in archives I accessed through a legal waiver, stated the following: subject exhibits symptoms of extreme malnourishment and psychological trauma. Absence of ocular response suggests partial or complete blindness. Fingernails appear to have been removed intentionally, healed over weeks ago. Scarring indicates multiple previous restraints. No evidence of infection. Repeats the same 7-note melody under her breath, constantly. That melody, identical to the lullaby Eleanor Frein used to play on the piano. When asked her name, the girl said only one word: mirror. She repeated it 26 times over the course of 2 hours. When townsfolk heard what had happened, panic simmered beneath the storm-soaked streets. No one said the Frain's name aloud, but every eye turned uphill, toward 14 Bramble, toward the black fence, and most damning of all, toward the unmistakable quilt. Viola Finch, the maid who vanished, had a distinct way of sewing, hand-stitched vines curling along the hem, the same pattern seen on the child's blanket. Sheriff Harlan Cole, to his credit, did what no one else would. He rode up the hill alone. He knocked once, no answer. He pounded again, this time calling out, "Dr. Frein, I need to speak with you about a child left at the Finch house." A long pause followed, and then the voice of Eleanor filtered through the thick oak door. "We have no child by that name." No name had been given. Sheriff Cole returned to town, visibly shaken. The next morning, he ordered a search of county orphanage records and adoption ledgers. Nothing. He sent a request to the state for birth certificates. None matched the child's appearance or age. By the 3rd day, the girl had stopped speaking entirely. Her hair began to fall out in patches. Her hands twitched in sync with the lullaby's rhythm. And then she began to scream, not words, but high animalistic keening, as though something was being dragged out from inside her. The night nurse claimed that when she tried to calm the child, the overhead mirror in the infirmary cracked without contact, a thin, jagged fracture running corner to corner. No object had struck it, no temperature change. It simply split. The next morning, the girl was gone. No signs of forced entry, no witnesses. Her blanket remained folded on the edge of the bed. Her pulse chart ended at 3:06 a.m. She was never seen again. The nurse who last saw her, Ruthie Vance, quit her position that very day. In her resignation letter, she scrawled a single line. It didn't climb out the window, it climbed out of the mirror. News traveled fast. Whispers ignited. The church held a closed-door vigil. Families kept their children inside after dusk. And finally, people began to speak the name they'd been afraid to utter for a decade. Frayne. Still, no warrant was issued. No child protective agents, no state intervention. It was still too early for such systems to exist in rural Kentucky. The sheriff requested a wellness check. The Fraynes refused. And yet, someone else wasn't willing to let it go. Because that same night, someone entered the town archives and pulled every birth record from 1878 onward. It was the first sign that someone outside of East Sundell was beginning to pay attention. They called it a courtesy visit, October 2nd, 1890. Sheriff Harlan Cole returned to 14 Bramble with a state physician named Dr. Isaac Pennington and a social investigator from Louisville, Ms. Ada Bell. It was the first time anyone had attempted a formal inquiry into the Fraynes household, a visit that, on paper, lasted 27 minutes. Dr. Pennington's private notes, recovered from the University of Louisville Medical Archives, tell a very different story. He wrote in heavy pencil, his script ragged and fast, entered 14 Bramble Street, under polite but firm refusal of consent. Dr. Silas Frayne met us at the gate, expressed deep distress at being harassed during such a sacred process, claimed he was mid-treatment of spiritual reclamation in vulnerable vessels, refused to define terms, interior dark, heavily curtained, unnatural cold in parlor, mirrors on every wall, facing downward or angled toward floor. Clock ticked, but showed no time. Stench of milk, vinegar, and ash, no children visible. Eleanor remained upstairs, would not descend. Whispered lullaby heard faintly from basement. Repeated 7-note pattern. Sheriff appeared disturbed, said nothing. Bell pale and trembling. Despite the deeply unsettling atmosphere, the investigators were not permitted to inspect the upstairs or the basement. Silas claimed the children were sleeping and unwell. Eleanor never came down. Ms. Bell filed an official complaint 3 days later with the Bureau of Child Health and Welfare. Her testimony is brief, but damning. I was unable to locate or interview a single minor despite years of reported guardianship. No adoption records, medical charts, or baptismal documentation were provided. Dr. Frayne spoke in riddles. Repeated phrase, clean by silence, clean by stillness, clean by sleep. Atmosphere of the home suggests psychological delusion or calculated deceit. I believe there may be unreported deaths in this household. The response, her file was marked inconclusive. No warrant was issued because in 1890s Kentucky, parental authority, especially among respected white landowning professionals, was rarely questioned without evidence of visible harm, and the Fraynes had always stayed just beneath that threshold. Besides, Sheriff Cole, by then, had begun to withdraw. According to his sister's journal, he suffered from nightmares following the visit. She wrote, Harlan wakes up screaming, said he saw a child staring from the mirror, said it grinned but had no mouth. He resigned 2 weeks later and left the state. His successor never reopened the file, and so the case was shelved. Ada Bell wrote a final letter to her superior, dated October 15, 1890. We knocked, they answered, but the door never truly opened. I fear those children will be buried before anyone asks their names. She died 6 months later in a house fire. Arson suspected. No arrests made. Meanwhile, Silas and Eleanor carried on undisturbed. Deliveries of crib linens and reflective glass resumed. The odor of burnt lavender and vinegar became a constant in the wind, and the lullabies, Those eerie, tuneless lullabies never stopped. Some neighbors claimed they began hearing them from their own walls, but beneath the silence, someone was listening. A second file appeared in the state archive a few months later, unsigned, unsealed, tucked behind other records. It included copied birth announcements from 6 counties, cross-referenced with Frayne supply orders, freight receipts, and pharmacy invoices. Red threads were beginning to form. Someone, somewhere, wasn't letting go, and neither was I. Because decades later, when I found this file, I realized I was not the first to pull on this thread, but I might be the last. It would take another year and another loss before the first thread was finally pulled hard enough to snap. Her name was Lyda Maycroft, age 17, position traveling Sunday school volunteer from Madison County. She disappeared on April 4, 1891, while on her way to deliver supplies to the Fraynes: crayons, children's Bibles, and cotton cloth for infant swaddles. She'd been told by the parish to make contact with the orphans on Bramble Hill. Her pastor said she was excited to bring scripture to those poor, forgotten souls. Her body was never found. But her satchel was discovered 5 days later in the creek behind the Frayne property. The satchel was zipped with cord. Inside were 4 items: a water-damaged Bible, its first page torn out, a small bottle of mirror polish, half used, a linen ribbon, tied in a bow, stained with what appeared to be breast milk, a page from a journal, her journal, the ink still legible. I saw them, not babies, not anymore. They stare up, but they don't blink. I think they're waiting for someone, or something. Their skin looks like wet candle wax. Their mirrors don't work, and one of them laughed when I prayed. That satchel ended up in the wrong hands, the right hands, really. A journalist from Lexington named Ezra Dane caught wind of the discovery. Dane was 34, freshly disgraced after being fired from the Courier for publishing a piece accusing a state senator of ritual abuse. The case was dismissed, but Ezra wasn't finished. He still had connections, and he had one obsession: lost children. He arrived in East Sundell 2 weeks after Lyda's disappearance. He posed as a census inspector, claiming he was updating town family records. But Ezra wasn't just taking head counts. He was gathering patterns, noticing gaps, finding names that appeared and vanished with eerie regularity around the Fraynes. His private notes, which I unearthed in a crate stored beneath the Lexington City archives, tell a haunting story. Every 5 to 6 months, a new child is seen near 14 Bramble, usually under age 2, always pale, always silent, no school enrollment, no church, then gone, no death certificate, no burial. House records show no increase in occupants, but deliveries spike around same time: cribs, cloth, formula, crushed bone charcoal. Why? Ezra began knocking on doors, asking questions no one dared say aloud. He interviewed the laundress, the postmaster, even Father Reese. When he asked about the mirrors, the priest went pale. They say the mirrors in that house don't reflect the child unless it's clean, not from dirt, from sin. Ezra's investigation exploded outward. He began connecting the Fraynes to a web of disappearances across 4 counties. In one chilling notation, he writes, "Eleanor was a midwife's daughter. Her mother practiced a fringe sect of purification theology, believed infants absorbed ancestral sin in the womb. Cleansing must occur before the eye of self opens. Mirrors used to detect spiritual rot." He cross-checked Eleanor's lineage. Her mother had been institutionalized for drowning twins in 1847, claiming they refused to reflect. No charges were filed. Ezra's breakthrough came when he found the shipment records. Through a contact in the freight office, he uncovered invoices signed by Silas Frayne for specular-grade silver nitrate, custom reverse glass bassinets, and most disturbingly, infant restraints, padded iron. He wrote a damning exposé called The Saints of Sundell, Mirrors, Milk and Murder, and sent it to 5 publications. Only one responded. They refused to print it, but offered him hush money. He declined. He sent his findings to the local magistrate. No reply. He tried to reach the state governor's office. Silence. Then, just as suddenly as he appeared, Ezra Dane vanished. Last seen boarding a train to return to Lexington. He never arrived. His remaining notes were mailed to his sister 4 days later. No return address. And yet the story was out. A few copies of Ezra's report had slipped through, and one made it to the desk of an early bureau investigator, a man named Thomas R. Whitlock, a man whose great-grandson still lives in Kentucky and who, decades later, helped me find the file that tied it all together. Because by now, it was clear. The Frains were not just eccentric caregivers. They were following a system, a ritual, a belief older than the town itself. And the mirrors were not for decoration. They were the test. By the spring of 1891, the Frains' immaculate facade was collapsing like rotted wood under pressure. Not publicly, no, not yet, but in the shadows, under ledgers and whispers, and Ezra Dane's scattered breadcrumbs, the story was beginning to stitch itself together. And what emerged wasn't merely criminal, it was orchestrated, calculated, ritualistic. One of the most damning revelations came not from a newspaper or a police raid, but from a former apothecary apprentice named Walter Dinch. I found his signed affidavit buried in the bowels of the Kentucky Department of Records, never filed officially. He'd been 19 when he delivered chemical shipments to the Frain home from a supply house in Lexington. Walter wrote, "I always thought it strange. Dr. Frain never ordered laudanum or chloroform like other physicians. His requests were odd. Silver nitrate, vinegar, milk-curdling agents, once formalin with added sage oil. And he always asked for mercury-backed glass, unframed, cut to exact infant cradle size. I asked once what it was for. He told me, 'You can't trust what the eye sees. The mirror sees the soul's filth. We filter that out.' The shipments spiked every 5 months, like clockwork. Around the same time, county records showed a disturbing trend, a trail of unregistered births, clustered tightly around East Sundell, all ending with dead ends. Young, unmarried women reported being sent to the Frains for maternal confinement, a common 19th-century euphemism for discreet, out-of-wedlock births. Some women returned, most never did, and no one ever saw the children again. One woman's journal, Lydia Moorcroft, age 16, contained only one entry the day before she vanished. "They say I'll be safe, that the doctor has holy glass, that my child will be clean. But the room smells like vinegar, and the walls are covered in reflections that move when I don't." She and her baby were never found. A map I reconstructed from these records formed a near-perfect spiral pattern with 14 Bramble Street at its center. Each pin on the map, each mother, each delivery, each missing infant was a spoke in a wheel of silence. And then there were the financial records. Through probate filings, I uncovered that the Frains were funneling money into something called the Society for the Doctrine of Return. On paper, it looked like a religious charity based out of Ohio, but the building it was registered to no longer stood. Burned in 1873, the only surviving paperwork described their mission in a single line: to wash away the first sin and return the child to the mirror's silence. One surviving document, a pamphlet water-damaged and moth-bitten, contained a chilling diagram, 12 cribs arranged in a circle, above each one, a mirror. In the center, a single black orb labeled Occlusio. Below, a phrase written in ink and underlined twice: "That which casts no reflection is closest to the divine." That line appears again in Eleanor Frain's private diary. Pages of it, torn and preserved in an envelope tucked inside Ezra Dane's personal notes, describe her convictions with clinical, almost maternal devotion. The children arrive unclean, blood-thick with the weight of generations. If the mirror rejects them, they must be purified. If they cry in reflection, the soul remains attached. But if they lie still and the glass stays silent, then they are ready. She refers to the process as mirroring, and the stages she describes are brutal. Stage 1, isolation. No mother may hold the child after the first breath. Attachment corrupts, she writes. Stage 2, starvation. A stripping of the flesh's memory. No breast milk, only formula laced with silver tincture. Stage 3, reflection. The child is placed in a bassinet beneath the consecrated mirror for 12 hours. No contact, no sound. If the mirror shows no reflection, the child is deemed past. Stage 4 is called vessel return. She never explains what that means. There is no mention of the ones who fail, but I found something else, buried beneath the house's medical supply logs. A second ledger, handwritten, dated, numbered. 41 entries, each marked with a date, a set of initials, and one of two symbols, a perfect circle, O, or a small X. O appeared next to only 12 of the entries. The rest bore the X. I believe these were the children who did not pass, and I believe I know what became of them. Because not long after this, the sheriff's office received an anonymous envelope. No return address, no message, just two photographs. The first, the Frine basement, dimly lit, showing a line of small cribs. In each one, an infant, wrapped tightly in white cloth, all still, all with small, downward-facing mirrors suspended above their heads by curved iron arms. The second, a close-up of one of the mirrors. In it, nothing, no crib, no child, just the wooden ceiling. The next morning, the sheriff signed the order. After a decade of silence, East Sundal was finally going to open the basement. They called it the Doctrine of Return. Others later called it a cult, a doctrine of angels without eyes, of infants as vessels, of salvation through absence. But those were modern words. The Fraines never used them. What they believed was far older than Kentucky, older than Scripture, and it lived underground. When Sheriff Ellis Barnum, newly appointed, received the two photographs anonymously delivered to his desk on April 30th, 1891, he did what his predecessor never could. He acted. That night, under cover of darkness and backed by 3 deputies and 1 physician, the sheriff approached 14 Bramble Street with a signed writ of entry. They knocked. No answer. They kicked in the door. The Fraines didn't resist. They were waiting. According to the official raid report, what little survives of it, Silas was seated in the parlor, hands folded, as if in prayer. Eleanor stood behind him, silent, barefoot, her dress soaked from the hem to the knees. She was humming. The melody, the same 7-note lullaby heard from the basement for years. Sheriff Barnum asked them directly, "Where are the children?" Silas replied, "Only the clean remain." And then, almost absently, he added, "Those unmirrored were returned." The glass closed their mouths. The deputies proceeded through the house. What they found was well beyond anything their rural training had prepared them for. The home was sterile. Clean, yes, but oppressively so. Bleached walls, wooden floors scrubbed down to splinters, every window sealed shut with black-painted boards. The mirrors in the parlor were all facing downward, angled perfectly at the floor, as if to avoid contact with anything human. But the real horror began in the basement. They had to break the lock, heavy iron, reinforced from the outside. When the door opened, every lantern in the room reportedly flickered, despite being oil-fed. What they saw has been pieced together only from conflicting testimonies, water-damaged police logs, and one surviving photograph, never published but preserved in a sealed archive in Frankfurt. 12 cribs, arranged in a perfect ring, crib to crib, each identical, no personal items, no names, just swaddled shapes lying still beneath iron mirror frames suspended above them. 11 of the cribs were empty, 1 was not. The 12th crib held what the report described only as a preserved infant, gender unclear, waxen skin, open mouth, eyes blackened, no decomposition, apparent use of alchemical preservation. The mirror above this crib was cracked, but not shattered, a hairline fracture across the center like a split in reality itself. Behind the circle of cribs stood a wooden structure, an altar perhaps, made of reclaimed beams. Carved into the wood was a symbol not found in any known doctrine, a ring with a single vertical line splitting it in half. Beneath it, a phrase etched in Latin, puritas per negationem, purity through negation. And beneath that, in fresh ink, barely dry, they do not reflect, because the soul has been silenced. That night, the Fraines were taken into custody, but Eleanor wouldn't stop humming. Not through the arrest, Not during the wagon ride to the jail, not even when they stripped her of her jewelry and apron and locked her in a cell. She stopped only once, when asked directly what the mirrors were for. She looked up, made eye contact for the first time, and said, "The body lies, the breath lies, but the mirror does not." When pressed, Silas eventually explained, rambling, increasingly incoherent, that their beliefs stemmed from a pre-Anglican purity sect, known only through fragments passed down through Eleanor's family. A sect that believed children were born spiritually poisoned, their souls tarnished not by sin, but by memory, the ancestral record of all those who had come before them. Their goal, he said, was to empty the vessel before memory returned. The mirrors were the test. A clean child would cast no reflection, because they had not yet awakened the eye of self. If the mirror showed movement, if the image breathed, flinched, blinked, that child was not clean. That child had to be returned. Returned to where? He never said. In Eleanor's confiscated diary, she writes, "Reflections are the whispers of the flesh. The mirror is God's lens. A child who reflects has already begun the corruption of becoming. Those who show nothing have passed through the door." It wasn't murder in their minds. It was preservation, an act of faith, a doctrine based not in blood, but in the absence of it. They never called what they did killing. They called it releasing the vessel. When investigators searched the surrounding land, they found no graves, no bones, but in the woods behind the house, buried beneath years of ivy and decay, they unearthed a pit lined with shards of shattered mirrors. Thousands of pieces. Some still had traces of silvering. Others bore oily smudges, the size of infant hands, and among them they found 12 iron hooks bolted into a wooden frame, child-sized restraints. The theory: the children who failed the mirror test were bound, observed, and ultimately left to fade. The 12 marked circles in the frame's ledger weren't the dead ones. They were the survivors, the ones who passed, the ones who reflected nothing. May 3rd, 1891. It was a Sunday. Rain had returned, cold and metallic, like the town itself was trying to cleanse what had been uncovered 2 days earlier. By mid-morning, 14 Bramble Street was crawling with men in long coats and gloves, state agents with lanterns and shovels, while townsfolk stood just beyond the black picket fence, gripping their hats and murmuring prayers they barely remembered how to say. The Frains were already in custody, but their house still had things to say. The second raid was no longer polite. This was not about wellness or warnings anymore. This was exhumation. The attic was the first shock. It was locked from the outside with 3 bolts, and when opened, investigators found a room lined wall to wall with mirrors. But not just any mirrors. These were distorted, curved, cracked, clouded with residue. Every single one had been affixed to a cradle-sized chair. In each chair, a soiled cloth lay folded. No names, no toys, no signs of life. Just one thing repeated again and again. Carved into the backs of each chair was a symbol, a ring split by a vertical line, and a word, reditus, Latin for return. There were 41 chairs, matching the 41 entries in the Frains' personal ledger. In the pantry, behind a false wall, they found what authorities initially believed to be a cold cellar. But as the lanterns flickered and breath fogged the air, it became clear it was a storage vault. Glass jars lined the shelves, dozens of them, sealed with wax and filled with liquid. Formalin, silver nitrate, milk solutions, and inside each, tiny slivers of something else. Fingernails, strands of hair, even what one agent described as calcified remains resembling infant teeth. In the fireplace behind the parlor, investigators uncovered charred bundles, ashes fused with bone. The bone was human, the scale, infant. They also recovered 12 iron crib frames buried in the earth beneath the house's foundation, hidden in a chamber accessed by a trapdoor beneath the floorboards, a place not listed on any house plan. Here's what's important. 11 of the frames were empty, but the 12th, inside, was a figure, mummified, preserved with herbs and powder, its face partially covered in what appeared to be gauze stitched into the skin. The body wore no clothing. only a necklace made of mirror shards strung together by silk thread, and on the wall above the frame, etched directly into the stone, "This one did not breathe. This one was born empty. Praise be to the silent vessel." Outside the house, in the surrounding field, a makeshift grave was finally located, disguised as a dry well. Inside, wrapped in layers of quilted cloth and sealed in wax-lined boxes, were the partial remains of 9 more children. Age estimates ranged from infancy to roughly age 5. Each showed signs of prolonged malnutrition. None were officially identified. No names, no records. Only one box contained a note, etched on the inside of the lid. "This one reflected. This one remembered. We closed her mouth with prayer." The story broke nationally in early June, under the headline, "Angels of Death. Kentucky couple charged in infant purification deaths." The town tried to retreat into silence, but it was too late. Journalists arrived from New York, Boston, even Europe. Spectacle followed horror. The Frains were paraded in chains, Eleanor still humming, Silas gaunt and silent, blinking only when he saw the courtroom mirrors covered in black cloth. They never confessed in court. They didn't need to. The evidence was overwhelming. The ledger, the photographs, the preserved remains, the basement, the symbols. But the defense made a chilling move. They didn't argue innocence. They argued divine exception. Silas's attorney, a man named Aubrey Tross, told the jury, "These were not murders. These were spiritual midwifings. The Frains did not kill, they cleansed. They freed children from the cycle of corruption, from the tyranny of identity. Look at their hands. Do they look like monsters or missionaries?" The courtroom recoiled. Eleanor never took the stand, but on the 3rd day of trial, she screamed once, just once, when a bailiff uncovered the mirror above the evidence table. Her eyes went wide. Her mouth moved soundlessly. She collapsed to the floor and never spoke again. Medical notes say she entered a catatonic state. She remained that way until her death 6 months later, after a self-inflicted neck wound made with a broken teacup. Silas lived longer. He was sentenced to life imprisonment at Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary. He died 4 years later of what the autopsy described as progressive mental degradation, leading to complete cessation of speech, appetite, and recognition. His final act was to write the word mirror over and over on the walls of his cell, 17 times. The Frain house was demolished in August 1892, but some locals say the foundation still hums if you stand on it at dusk, that the lullaby still drifts up through the soil, that no mirror in East Sundell has ever hung straight since. After the trial, East Sundell ceased being a town, not officially. The buildings remained, the post office operated, the Sunday bells still rang, but the soul of the place, the collective heartbeat, went silent. Because you cannot return to normal after something like this. Not when you learn your saints were surgeons of suffering. Not when you realize you clapped for the very people who unmade children like bad paintings. The Frains were convicted on 7 counts of child endangerment, 2 counts of negligent manslaughter, and 4 charges of unlawful internment of human remains. But that was it. The problem was, the law couldn't prosecute what it couldn't understand. No statute existed for spiritual cleansing through mirrored absence. No language in Kentucky's penal code accounted for death by ritual reflection. The prosecutors knew the truth. The state knew the truth. But the law moved in inches, while horror sprinted ahead. Eleanor's suicide stunned the public. She was the face most people knew, the woman who handed out cider at harvest time, who sang hymns to orphans in the chapel, who gave every widow a smile and every neighbor a prayer. Her death was declared an act of hysteria-induced self-harm, but her suicide note said otherwise. It was barely a note. Just a torn piece of mirror, its edge smeared with dried blood, and a single word scratched in the glass. Reflected. Silas's death inside Brushy Mountain was no more peaceful. His physician, Dr. Edwin Lackley, recorded the deterioration in meticulous detail. He ceased to speak after month 4, ate only white bread soaked in water, refused light, would not look at reflective surfaces, including spoons or glass. repeatedly scratched the symbol into the wall, a ring split by a vertical line. Said once, "They're all silent now, we did good." Of the 41 children listed in the Frayne ledger, only 12 were marked with the circle symbol, those deemed to have passed the mirror test. And of those 12, only 3 were found. The first was Anna Prim, adopted at age 3 by a traveling Methodist family who never knew her origin. When interviewed in 1915, she described faint memories of cold cribs and women with no eyes. She suffered from night terrors and developed full-body tremors whenever she entered a room with uncovered mirrors. Anna eventually took her own life. Her suicide note ended with, "I see her when I blink, but not when I look." The second was Jacob Withers, later renamed Caleb by the Quaker family who raised him in Indiana. He became a music teacher, lived a quiet life, but he never slept more than 3 hours at a time. He kept every reflective surface in his home covered in lace. He left behind a diary. The final entry read, "They said we were empty, that we were born without, but I remember the glass breaking. I remember screaming. I was 2. I shouldn't remember anything, but I do." The third was never named. A girl found wandering near Stamping Ground in late 1891, wearing only a muslin shift and a ribbon around her neck made of mirror shards. She was mute. She never spoke. She was institutionalized until 1904, when she vanished from her room without a trace. The only thing left behind, a mirror in the corner, cracked diagonally, just like the one from the Frayne's basement. The families of the missing children never received answers, no reparations, no graves to mourn, only boxes of cloth, only silence. One mother, Louise Banning, whose daughter had been sent to serve under Eleanor Frayne's supervision, wrote in her journal, "They told me she had moved west, married, healthy, happy, but I can still hear the lullaby. It lives in the walls. My daughter doesn't visit in dreams because she never learned to sleep." In the years that followed, the town tried to erase the case. The Frayne home was demolished. The church removed their name from the ledger of benefactors. The street was renamed from Bramble to Mercy Hill, but the cracks remained. Even now, more than a century later, descendants speak in hushed tones. Some still cover their mirrors after dark. Some report hearing tapping in the walls of old homes. 7 taps, always 7, the number of notes in the lullaby, and the number of children estimated to still be missing. When I interviewed one of the town's oldest residents, Margaret Dunn, aged 96, she told me something I'll never forget. She said, "We thought they were saving the children. We didn't realize they were saving them from themselves, from being human, from being whole." The law caught the Fraynes, but it never caught what they unleashed. East Sundell is quiet now. It's not the quiet of innocence or peace or even ignorance. It's the stillness of a place that remembers what it cannot explain, what it cannot forgive. The Frayne house is gone. No trace remains of the structure that stood at 14 Bramble Street. The soil is leveled, a grassy patch surrounded by barbed hedges and rust. But if you ask anyone who lives there today, they'll tell you something lingers. Not ghosts, not voices, something worse. A silence that listens back. I visited what remains of the town a year ago. The chapel is shuttered. The school is a bed and breakfast now. No one talks about the Fraynes, not in daylight, but they remember. There is no plaque, no memorial marker, only a dent in the ground where children once wept without being held. A house where lullabies were whispered in place of screams, where mirrors judged what hearts should never measure, where innocence was treated like a toxin and silence the cure. But the legacy didn't stay buried. In 1902, Kentucky passed one of the earliest state-level child welfare laws in the nation, requiring registration of all births, oversight of informal adoptions, and biannual inspections of private care facilities. While the law never named the Frayne case, internal correspondence, letters between state agents and the governor's office, make it clear 14 Bramble Street cast a long shadow. Later, in 1918, the Child Mirror Act was introduced, a federal initiative meant to address psychological trauma in institutionalized minors. Its name, a coincidence, according to lawmakers. But if you dig far enough, you'll find one of the initial psychological advisors listed on the act, Thomas Whitlock, the grandson of the agent who assisted in the Frayne raid. And then there are the mirrors. In several counties across Kentucky, folklore emerged warning parents not to keep mirrors in nurseries, that mirrors steal names, or a baby who doesn't cry in the glass is not a baby at all. Some families hang muslin over cribs, others place bells near reflective surfaces. One family I spoke with in Boone County leaves a thimble of milk beneath every mirror to keep the glass fed. But the most haunting legacy belongs to the children themselves. Of the 41 entries in the Frayne's hidden ledger, 29 remain unaccounted for. No bodies, no records, no names, only initials, only symbols, only silence. And then there are the survivors. I sat down with a woman named Judith Lane, aged 83, who contacted me after reading a research notice I published in the Appalachian Genealogical Review. She'd spent her whole life not knowing where she came from. Her adoption records had been sealed, but her nightmares, those were always the same. A ring of cribs, a cold mirror above her face, the smell of vinegar and lavender, a lullaby she couldn't name but could hum with eerie accuracy. DNA confirmed the impossible. Judith Lane matched tissue samples collected from the remains found beneath the Frayne house in 1891. She is, to our knowledge, the last living survivor of the Frayne purification house. I asked her what she remembered, what she felt. She looked at me for a long time and said, "I was born twice, once in blood, once in silence, but I didn't disappear. That's how I know I was never clean." She keeps a small mirror in her home now, covered in lace. She says she'll never look into it again, not after what she saw last time, not after it showed her crib, not her face. And behind it, someone else's hand reaching down. There are plans now for a memorial garden. Not in East Sundell, too many still oppose it, but in Lexington, where survivors and families of the missing can come to leave flowers, toys, or just sit quietly. No mirrors allowed, only stones carved with names that were never spoken during the trial, and beneath each one, a simple inscription, born, reflected, remembered. Because we do remember them now. We say their names, even when we don't know them. We speak into the silence the Fraynes created. We reject the absence they worshipped. And we honor those children, not for their purity, not for their quiet, but for their humanity, sacred, screaming and whole. Because sometimes the most trusted people are the ones we should have feared most. This was the story of the macabre basement where every mirror faced a crib and none reflected back. I'm Daniel Harrow. This is the Macabre Record. Until next time, look closer and never trust a quiet nursery.